Nilai kami.
Tama.
Are you with me? I wanna dance by water beneath the Mexican sky.
Architecture, is that what you really, really want to do more than anything else in the world?
You gotta find your own voice.
And the architectural profession was just not doing anything to advance. The practice of architecture today is anything you choose. Your job as a graduate is to figure out what you want that to look like. Can't thank for reality.
It's just not knowing what's next after graduation.
I have always felt if you know what you're going to do in advance, then you won't do it.
Have you ever wondered what other careers you can pursue with a degree in architecture?
A very good evening to everyone. We are extremely happy to welcome you all to the second session of ARCHCULT' Musings, the ARCHCULT'21 guest lecture series. We would like to thank each one of you for being here with us today. On this occasion, we would also like to thank our sponsors, our travel partner Red Taxi, creative partner Wacom, our online publicity partner ARCHiVoice, photography partner Indian Institute of Photography, and our online workshop partners Carva, Clipocher, and Prayog.
We would like to introduce our guest of the evening, Dr. Benny Kuriakose, principal designer of Benny Kuriakose and Associates. His projects, Musings Heritage Project, Dakshana Chitra, and Aleppo Heritage Products, and many more need no introduction. He is a well-accomplished designer, received his doctorate in IIT Madras, and also has earned his degree at the University of York. He is here to reminisce about his past experiences relating to the field of conservation architecture and enlighten us. Now it is my greatest pleasure to welcome Dr. Benny Kuriakose to our cult. Over to you, sir.
Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Okay. I'll straight away go into the presentation. And then I think it will last for about half an hour, and then we can have some questions and answers, is the way it has been scheduled. So I'm going to share the screen. Yeah. Can you see my screen?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Okay. I'll just. Yeah, that's right. I mean, since you asked me to talk about conservation, I think conservation is generally seen as a there are a lot of misconceptions about conservation. But I think conservation is a tool for development. And also, it is something which is very sustainable. So I'm just trying to make this argument in this presentation. One of the beliefs is that people generally have a notion that conservation and development will not go together. They are against each other. But through conservation, we can achieve development. And that's one of the points I'm just trying to make it in this. Of course, it is true that architecture and conservation is still more of an elitist kind of profession. But I strongly believe that conservation can solve many of the problems which we face these days. And that's the mainly the argument. This is one of the buildings that we have conserved. It's the residence. It was in a bad shape. And I'm just showing some visuals. I mean, it's fully made out of timber. There were no masonry parts at all in this building. Masonry walls were completely lacking. So we had to do a kitchen. We had to add a toilet, everything within these timber walls. So there were 2 bedrooms as part of this. And this is one of the typical building construction methods which is there in the southern part of Kerala. Travancore, Kochi, the old princely states usually used to have timber walls. 100 years ago, this was the main. Most of the aristocratic or even the middle class houses were made with timber walls. And this particular house has a courtyard where the natural light comes. And the courtyard is bigger means the house is bigger. And the houses had veranda all around the houses. And this is the typical Naligata which you call. There were very little furniture used in these houses in the olden days. And you can see that that carving which you see around 2.5 feet from the floor level is what comes at the eye level when you sit on the floor. I'm just showing some before and after pictures for you to get an idea. One of the principles in conservation is to use minimum changes, say, in trying to get. So this is regarding the courtyard. You can see due to leakage of the roof, some of the timber planks and this is a, you can say, a 300-year-old market or 250-year-old, where you can find a lot of buildings which have a little bit Portuguese character, colonial character, etc. And which was once a flourishing market, and it's by the side of the river, Periyar. But what subsequently happened, bridges came, and in the olden days, water was the main means of transport. So the goods was, the boats were in Kerala, instead of the present lorries, the boats were carried all the goods and they brought it to the market and sold it. But now that has gone quite a bit. So you can find some old buildings like this. It was like an urban design solution, a history, which we studied and tried to work out some solution for this, including the waste management, lighting, toilet issues, how to improve the buildings, how to solve the technical problems. But the interesting fact about this market was that it was still running in a traditional way. You can still find jute bags where the chili, all these supermarkets, etc., coming up even into small towns have changed the way the things are being sold. So you can still sing the market, they still sell it in a traditional way. And you can see that we're trying to repair the buildings. Of course, there were a lot of changes which has happened. So we're just trying to make the building more suitable. You can see some stone paving in the back, in the foreground. I mean, what you see in the background is some roofs are being repaired. So you can see the before and after in this picture. There was a new building which is coming up. Conservation is very positive, allowing for new buildings. It's not a no to all new buildings. So there could be a lot of new buildings coming up as part of the conservation. And here you can see the changes before and after which is happening. And in this case, we can see, I mean, it's not from the same angle, but you can still see that the badam tree is there in both the photographs. And the metal sheets they put, trying to make it look much better or nicer. Here also you can see the change. I mean, there are not many 3-story and 4-story buildings in this market. But a lot of buildings have undergone changes. So we were just trying to work with the shop owners and the owners of these properties that they try to work on conserving their heritage or making it. So as I said, along the waterfront, I mean, we designed an amphitheater, and we can see various programs happening in the amphitheater. I mean, this is now one of the major gateways. These were some of the restaurants which have come up in the amphitheater as part of the thing, overlooking the water body. There is a boat jetty where people can come from various islands or other parts of the Kerala and land up in this market. And so we try to find solutions to various issues like drainage, some of the issues which are there in these areas. And this is a chapel which was there in the historic core. And it was when we tried to find the chapel first, it was painted with all sorts of colors. Looks like the advertisement of Asian paint. And so we put in our presentations that the color should be made a bit more. I mean, it doesn't go with the historic surroundings or with historic buildings all around. So we just painted it white and tried to show it to the people. And we had various presentations with the shop owners and those things. But then even to our strange surprise, there was a demand from the local community that the chapel should be demolished. And they wanted us to give a design for the new chapel. And this is what you see. Old chapel has been demolished. You can see the same steps. If you look at it, the steps in front of the chapel. And this is, you can see the chapel, which is a replica of the chapel which was there in the olden days, much before. This chapel has come in the early 1980s. So what has been replaced, that building was a chapel in the 1980s, what was existing there. And that is what has been done. Another project which we got involved is Juma Masjid. I mean, there's an older photograph. It looks like a small house or a temple. There's an older photograph of the building. And the mosque people wanted to restore its soul form. So what you see here is a newspaper report which came in the Hindu newspaper. Now we can see that old structures got converted with minarets and domes and steel trusses and concrete roofs, everything you can think about in this. They made a lot of additions to the old building over a period of time. And this is what has happened. And this was another older photograph of the mosque. And this is supposed to be the oldest mosque in India. The mosque website says that the mosque is 7th century. And they even claim that it's the second oldest mosque in the world. But definitely, historians attribute the dates to 1048 AD, which means it's the 11th century mosque. Even if it is the 11th century mosque, it is the oldest mosque in India, because this is before the Afghan, Khiljis, and all these Mughals, etc., came into India, so much before that. So this was the old photograph which we received about the mosque. And this is a photograph which I had taken about this mosque in 1984. So already the minarets and domes and some of those concrete things are there. And the earlier photograph, when we took over the photograph, when took over the building, this was the state of affairs. They further extended it in the 1990s, and that's what you see. The mosque people approached us that they would like to restore the mosque the way it was there in the olden days, and which I showed the black and white photograph. But the problem they had was that the old mosque will house only 250 or 300 people, whereas the new mosque, with all these additions and extensions, used to house 2,000 people. So they wanted a thing, they said, being the oldest mosque with a lot of people coming to worship there. So they said, can we find a solution of where we can house 2,000 people? So we just worked out a solution. We worked out two solutions. One is to have a basement. The other is to have an airport hangar roof where 2,000 people can still pray, but you demolish all the ugly additions, the concrete and the domes and steel trusses, all those things, and bring back the mosque, but at the same time. So finally, the solution which the mosque authorities wanted to go was with the construction of a mosque below the ground. So what we did was make a proposal below. What you see is the 3D visual. You can see, there are three entrances to the basement mosque, and you will see where. So once the basement mosque is finished, you will see only the the same old mosque which you will see. So this is one of the other three visuals. So you will see it is not a symmetrical building, although symmetry is very much a part of the Islamic architecture. You can see the side view of the mosque that we try to work out with the mosque authorities. Most of these were based on the older photographic evidences of the mosque. And so we just had these timber things. We did not want anything to be made out of timber or even made out of concrete or anything. They need the ablution area where they wash their feet before they enter the mosque. They need some information center. So we try to plan for all these things on both sides of the mosque. And this is how the mosque, when it was handed over to us. The proposal took such a long time because it has to undergo various committees. They have to collect the money for the new mosque. It is not a cost-effective. It's 2,000 people capacity mosque is not a cost. It won't come. So there was but finally, when they were assured of the kind that it can work or it can be built, though, to my surprise, when I started planning, I never thought that this will be any time going to happen. And so all the domes and minarets and concrete and steel, everything was demolished. And what has come in its place is this is the mosque which you see. If you visit the place now, the project is still not inaugurated. This is the mosque that you see. And there is a basement mosque which will house 2,000 people below the ground, the area. So what you see is the roof of the basement is what you see as part of the thing. This is another photograph of the new mosque which is there now. The basement is under finishing. The project, we hope to finish the mosque, which has been restored, to be inaugurated in the next 1 or 2 months. Another project we did as part of conservation is Aleppo, which is a tourist place, already a tourist place. A lot of footprints are there. There are canals there. It's called the Venice of the East. And that is what we just try to do. And these are the photographs when we try to go there and take photographs. It's like a, it's like a heritage master plan for the entire historic town of Aleppo. So it was a long. We are working on the project for the last 5 years. So when we looked at it, the canals were very dirty. You can't call a canal a canal. It was more like a drain. Which is the situation of many of them. In Chennai, if you take Kuam River, it's more like a drain. Although people call it a river, so situation is very bad. Situation was not very different in Aleppo as well, where then their waste is dumped into these canals. And beautiful historic buildings along the canals. There is no point in conserving the historic buildings without cleaning up the canals. There are 2 main canals called Wada Canal and Commersu Canal, and there is a link canal. The overall length of these 3 main canals will be coming to somewhere around 18 kilometers, but there are so many sub-canals which feed the water to the main canal. So we realize that there is no point in cleaning up, because again, it is going to be filled with wastewater. So we just try to clean some of the sub-canals as part of the project. So what you can see is this is one of the sub-canals being cleaned. And this is where the main canals are being cleaned as part of the project. The retaining wall had to be built, some areas, because we had to remove 1 to 2 meters of silt, which consists of all kinds of water bottles and all those things. This was cleaned with a stretch. And I can say that now, most of the areas have been cleaned. Canals have been cleaned. Now the challenge is how to maintain these canals. We are working out on various ideas, which is as part of the canals. Now it has been made navigable. Because when all these historic buildings are on sides of the canals, simultaneously the conservation work of the historic buildings along the canals are happening. Various buildings, not 1, 2, or 5 or 10, much more than that. Buildings are being conserved as part of the process, as part of the heritage master plan. And the water has become clearer, so now you can see people trying to catch fish. You can see the scene in different places. You can see people swimming in the canals, etc., which is happening as part of the episode. The important thing is water played a very important role in most of the cities. Most of the historic cities are built along the sides of a river, whether it is London or Paris or Prague or any of those places. There is a river adjoining these historic cities. Many of the Indian cities are also not different. Varanasi, Allahabad, Delhi. You look at many of the cities, this is the kind of situation. So it is important to keep the waterways clean and give back the water to the people to do.
ആലപ്പുഴ തുറമുഖ നഗരം ഉണ്ടായിട്ട് 2 നൂറ്റാണ്ടിലേറെ കാലമായി. നമ്മുടെ ഈ വെനീസ് എന്ന ആലപ്പുഴയെ പറ്റി പറയുന്നത് കിഴക്കൻ നല്ല വൈബുള്ള സ്ഥലം. പണ്ട് ഇതൊക്കെ ഭയങ്കര രസമാണെന്ന് പറഞ്ഞ് കേട്ടിട്ടുണ്ട്. ഇപ്പോഴത്തെ അവസ്ഥ ഭയങ്കര മോശമാണ്.
നമ്മള് കനാല് ശുദ്ധീകരിച്ചു അങ്ങോട്ട് പോകുന്നുണ്ട്. പിന്നെ ചില റോഡിലേക്ക് ഇടക്കണം, ചില കക്കൂസുമായി ഇതെല്ലാം റോഡ് വളരെ വൃത്തികേടായി കിടക്കും.
Itself will not improve. The surrounding has improved. Local people has to take it. ജനങ്ങൾ സ്വയം ചെയ്യേണ്ട കാര്യങ്ങളാണ്.
ചെയ്യാവുന്നിടത്തോളം നല്ല ഇവർക്കൊന്നും ഒരു ഉത്തരവില്ല. പഞ്ചായത്ത് വന്ന് ഞങ്ങൾക്ക് ചെയ്തു തരാൻ പറയും.
വീടുകളിൽ നിന്നൊക്കെ ഇഷ്ടമായിരുന്നു ടാങ്കുകൾ. അതിനൊക്കെ ഒരു നല്ല രീതിയിലൊരു നിയന്ത്രണം. ഈ കനാൽ ഇങ്ങനെ ആക്കിയത് നമ്മളല്ലേ, ഇത് നമുക്ക് തന്നെ ഇത് റെഡിയാക്കാം. ഓരോ കനാലിനും 200 മീറ്റർ ഭാഗത്ത് അപ്പുറവും ഇപ്പുറമുള്ള വീടുകളെ ചേർത്ത് ഓരോ കമ്മിറ്റികൾ തുടങ്ങിയാൽ എന്താ? ആ ഭാഗത്തിന്റെ ഉത്തരവാദിത്വം അവരെ ഏൽപ്പിക്കുക. അവിടെ ഒരു CCTV ക്യാമറ സ്ഥാപിച്ചാൽ ആര് വന്ന് അവിടെ വേസ്റ്റ് ഇട്ടാലും തെളിവോടെ പരാതി കൊടുക്കാം. ഇങ്ങനെ ഒരു കനാലിലുള്ള എല്ലാ കമ്മിറ്റികളിൽ നിന്നും തെരഞ്ഞെടുക്കുന്ന ആളുകളെ ചേർത്ത് ആ കനാലിന് വേണ്ടി മൊത്തത്തിലൊരു കമ്മിറ്റിയും തുടങ്ങാം. ഒരു കനാൽ വൃത്തിയാക്കാൻ 3 പേരെ മാസക്കൂലിക്ക് നിയമിക്കുകയാണെങ്കിൽ തന്നെ ഇതിൽ നിന്ന് എത്ര പേർക്ക് തൊഴിൽ ലഭിക്കും? ഇങ്ങനെ ഓരോരോ വലിയ കാര്യങ്ങളൊക്കെ ചെയ്യുന്നത് ചെറിയ സ്വപ്നങ്ങളുണ്ട്. എല്ലാവരും ഒന്ന് ചോദിച്ചാൽ നമുക്ക് നടത്തിയെടുക്കാൻ പറ്റും. നമ്മുടെ ഓടെ ഓടെ
This was a documentary made by some young students as part of before we started cleaning up the canals. And this helped tremendously in ensuring the participation of the committee. And once the canals were cleaned, we had various events by which people bought their country boards. And when no navigation is to happen in the western, at least in the western part of the canal, which was completely filled with dirt and algae growth and plant growth and all those things. And this is what is happening. You can see that the sides of the canals is still not clean. We have just started working on the sides of the canal. And you can see, I mean, I'm just showing a video. And you can see the canals sites are not yet cleaned. See, one of the important arguments is that why it is conservation. In conservation, you reuse the whole building. You are recycling the whole building. And the greenest building is one which is already existing. All these old buildings have made their impact on the building. So however greener technology that you use, still it makes a significant impact on the environment. So conservation, by recycling the whole building, by reusing the whole building, it's the best way to look at the sustainability or sustainable architecture or the green architecture. That way it leads to development. Finding alternate uses for buildings is very positive. Conservation as a whole, it has developed in Europe and other countries as a reaction to modern architecture. Modern means in quotes, because the kind of buildings which were replacing the historic buildings, people became quite critical about it. Not only people, there were many others. Concrete disfigurement, concrete boxes, matchboxes, all kinds of words were used. So it's a movement which developed after the Second World War. The modern architecture took its roots and spread its wings in a big way in the 50s and 60s. That's the time when the conservation architecture also started taking its roots. Of course, over a period of time, tourism is considered to be an income-generating activity. Many of the Kerala's GDP, more than 20% is from tourism. Similarly, it's the same for many of the historic cities. So conservation and heritage tourism or cultural tourism has taken its roots. And conservation or historic heritage can pay towards the tourism. Now, some of the projects that we do, we get involved in conserving concrete buildings as well, because at once upon a time, people thought that concrete buildings are durable. It will last for centuries. Now people don't believe in it. People know that it also has its definite life. Concrete buildings might not last as long as much as many of our historic buildings or monuments or the temples or churches or many of the buildings that we see. And we are into conserving concrete buildings as well because they develop leaks. They become obsolete. See, Spencer Plaza in Chennai city has become obsolete. More than 20% of the malls in the US are closed, even before the pandemic, because they don't have visitors or customers. They are being converted into apartments and offices. Similarly, you have to conserve. It's a positive thing. And it's a never-ending profession. But I think it will become part of the mainstream at some point. I'm just showing some projects which we have done, and all the projects which I'm showing are just being recently completed. They are not being inaugurated. None of these projects are being inaugurated. This is a masjid on the coast of Aleppo, which we have conserved. And you can see the before photograph. You can see the metal sheet roof or the extension which they have made. And you can see how we have conserved that building. So it's not just bringing back to the old state. That is not the only thing. You can have extension, but have an extension which goes with the existing building is more important. And this is another view of the said mosque, which is being shown. And this is a church. It's the 16th century church which have just finished renovating. What you see on the right hand side is a 1970s facade. So, and what you see on the left, some of the old church is still intact, but you can still see some concrete additions and everything is as part of this. So we took up this one. And this was an older photograph of the same church which we found. And and the church has been restored or kind of thing, repaired and restored. And the extension which is made to the front is a new addition. The tile roof that you see in front is not there in the old mosque, old church. It has been added because the church people wanted to add it. But it is a reversible change. We did not use any concrete. Anytime you can take it out and you can bring it back to the old thing. And this is the interior of the church that we saw. And we try to, this is the interior. I mean, the project is not yet inaugurated. The furniture and a lot of things are yet to come. But this is how it looks now. I mean, we are just in the finishing stages, repairing the roof, repairing the leaks, make sure the rising dampness problem, many of the technical issues is done. So this is a photograph of the church, the way it is looking now. And I mean, this is the canal, Aleppo Canal, and this is one of the museum buildings. We are doing a museum. I mean, these two buildings, what you see, has been restored or conserved. I mean, there were factory buildings and godowns and things like that, and they have been conserved. I can see the sides of the river has been cleaned, and the contract has been awarded for developing pedestrian paths and cycle paths along the canal rivers on both sides of the canal. There will be pedestrian paths and cycle paths so that people can enjoy. I mean, what was a liability with mosquitoes and waste and rains is going to become an asset to the people of Aleppo. And we hope that Aleppo will become a more attractive place to live. I mean, these are some of the buildings which we have restored. I mean, a temporary exhibition, which is this Logame Tarawal, the world is one family, Kuchi Binale Foundation. Our buildings have been restored and it's being converted into museums. And some are being converted into godowns, some are being converted back into factories. But what you see is the buildings which has been dilapidated. People have written off these buildings. We have converted back, and you can see the temporary exhibition going on now by the Kuchi Binale Foundation. And this is another factory building. When you can see the old timber floor, we are not trying to bring back the building to the present, typical presenting. We just try to keep, I mean, you have an old building, there will be certain inconveniences and certain things you have to live with it. And these are the building. I mean, some changes we have made here and there because, I mean, this is a museum building which is going to come up. And there are various museums are being planned. I mean, but you can see these are the the factories which were dysfunctional for at least for the previous 40 years or 50 years, like that. Some are functioning with very limited staff or very limited production. So you can see these are the typical godowns which we have restored or conserved and hoping to convert it into a permanent museums. We are doing few museums are being planned for in these things. What I want to tell is that in this era of global warming and climate change, use minimum amount of material, recycle the building as a whole instead of recycling components of buildings. And conservation can pave the way for it. And conservation is very positive. It is not against new buildings coming up. It is objecting only to the way some of the buildings are coming up. Can't put a very concrete 10-story building next to a historic building. And that is which is being, I mean, there are certain rules and regulations and guidelines or conventions which are part of the buildings. So this is, I just wanted to give a feel that conservation and development will go together. Conservation is conservation is for development. Conservation is the best way to achieve, is the best, the building which is existing is the greenest building. And it can clean up our canals. It can make beautiful public spaces. Some buildings have been converted into museums. Some buildings can be converted into offices. We have made proposals for some of the buildings being converted into accommodation spaces. Of course, old buildings being converted into hotels and heritage hotels and charging a fancy price already. There are many models in India. What we need is development. What we need is a better place for the future generations, or an attractive place for the future generations to live. Architecture is there to make changes to life. And in that, conservation is a major part. It's a tool for development. And we practice as a firm, 50% of our buildings are new, 50% is conservation. And what we do as a whole is trying to reinforce this aspect that we have to learn from the past. Thank you. Any questions? Yes.
Yes, sir. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. We have a few questions from students and by us. So what importance is given by the government to conservation projects over ordinary projects, and how do we benefit from historical and architectural heritage preservation?
See, government is by the people, for the people, etc. But it doesn't happen that way. Our system is such a way that once we elect the MPs and MLAs, we won't be able to recall them. And what they take decisions are very, very important. So politicians generally will do things if they can. They are for development. And if they can win votes, they will definitely do. Over my experience during the last, I've been working in conservation for more than 35 years. I will say I started passed out in 84, took my degree in civil engineering in 84 and got interested in architecture. And so 1984 onwards, I've been seeing historic buildings. Somehow I got fascinated with historic buildings. And demolition of a historic building 40 years ago was never in news. Nobody bothered about it. But at least now you can see somebody tries to document it, somebody tries to file a case in the High Court or Supreme Court, or it becomes a news. That is a substantial change. I remember during my student days in the 1980s, Mathura oil refinery was set up by the government. And there was a huge hue and cry about that because the sulfur dioxide pollution, the sulfur pollution might harm the marble in Agra, Taj Mahal, because it's not very far away. Mathura and Agra are not very far away. It was the Indian History Congress I read at that time, which came out against the refinery. Unfortunately, none of the building professionals came out against it at that time. But now, conservation is slowly becoming a buzzword. There are so many courses in India. When I went to UK to do my master's in conservation, architectural conservation, 1986, there were no courses in India teaching conservation. Now in India, at least 10 or more than that courses will be there in various people. So the fact that the awareness about conservation has grown quite a bit. INTAC, Indian National Trust for Art and Cultural Heritage, which was established in 1984, has made a major part in it. And there are some heritage societies or organizations which works as in the local area as well. Kerala government has taken a lead role. Now every major project connected with cities and towns have been heritage conservation projects. It started with the Musings heritage project, which I did the master plan. I initiated the process. We had a finance minister at Dr. Thomas Isaac, who understood that conservation is a tool for development. He was an economist, was a professor of economics in one of the research institutes, Center for Development Studies, designed by Laurie Baker. But it's our bureaucrats and the politicians have to understand the importance of conservation as a whole. When you conserve a building, less energy is used, less materials are used. You are conserving the history, you are conserving the heritage, you are conserving certain values, otherwise which will disappear. And I think this is very, very important that governments come forward. Now the main problem which I face is that we do a lot of conservation projects. A lot of them are by the government also, or by the private enterprises as well. There is no shortage of money for conservation now. There are not enough qualified people to do conservation. Earlier, when I passed out in 1980s, only Archaeological Survey of India had the technical expertise to do conservation. But now that situation has changed. So I think it is positive. Even in UK or in Netherlands or in all these countries have taken decades to reach the present level. It didn't happen overnight. So that way, various state governments and the Indian government is thinking on these lines. That's it.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
There was another question. What is your approach to design after getting a brief? Do you start with a concept or materials, technologies, etc.?
See, architecture is very location specific. The way you design a building in the coastal area or near a beach will be very different the way you design a building up in the hills. It's very location specific. It is very client specific. Mohan will ask for a certain requirement, Shankar will have different requirements, Priya will have different requirements. It's also very climate specific. I mean, in very hot, humid climate in Chennai, it's one kind of architecture that has to be done. But in a very hot, dry climate, like in, say, Hyderabad, for example, it'll be a different kind of building which has to be evolved. It is the designer or the architect who thinks about this. So you look at the requirements, you look at these parameters or the various values, and my design normally evolves from these things, from the client's requirements. At the same time, none of my buildings look the same because none of my clients are the same. I don't have a style of my own, although you will find some similarities in my buildings. And I consciously try to make each design different. I think it is not right to call a designer if he tries to make every design look the same. And if you look at my websites, you will see none of the buildings looks the same. And I don't think it is very different because each client will come with his requirements. And one of the things which architects and designers have to clearly understand is that when they design a building, they should understand they are not creating a monument to last forever. They are creating a house for a Shankar or Priya or Mohan, for him to live in, for him to enjoy. And that is what one is trying to do. If you are designing a hospital, you have to design a hospital, and the patients who live there or come there should feel happy about it, should feel that this is a place where the illness is going to be cured, or they will get a relief from the pain or any of the, why did they come to a hospital? It should not be causing a feeling which is entirely opposite to this. That's why some of the people say, take me away from the hospital, allow me to die. When you design a primary school, you might be the greatest architect at the time, but unless you get into the shoes of a primary school child or 10-year-old child or 5-year-old child, forgetting the fact that you are designing a monument or something which the critics are going to talk about, your building is going to come in all the magazines, forgetting about that fact, is the child, 10-year-old child, going to enjoy the design that you have done. And that is more important. And that is one, as a designer, if you follow this rule, and this is exactly the rule which I follow, if my buildings are successful, if people like the kind of buildings that I do, it's because I follow this process which you have asked me to explain. I've tried to explain it in brief, but I mean, it's more or less this process which I normally try to follow. Okay.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. The next question is, how can we consciously reduce the impact on the environment in different stages of a project?
See, the word environment started getting used only for the last 60 years or 50 years. I mean, it's become a buzzword for that. I will try to say how I try to look at it. I look at the environment, and whenever I try to do the design, I try to look at how is it affecting the future. And nature, I'm not using the word environment very consciously. Nature is not just beaches and lakes and forests. It is all around you. Whether you are living in a city or in a village, nature is around you. You should make the least impact on the environment and the nature. If you don't do that, it will give back to you. And that is what we see in the much more frequent cyclones which are happening, much more frequent floods which are happening, much more frequent landslides which happen. Architecture is multi-dimensional. There's political dimensions, psychological dimensions, physical dimensions, economic dimensions. It's very multi-dimensional. And there are so many factors which influence architecture, which influences design. But start from the basic principles always. One of the principles I try to use more timber because it's one of the most sustainable building material, which is that you will find. So whenever I try to use timber in my buildings, which is very much a part of my design. So I use the materials. I try to use least, aluminum is the most expensive in terms of energy consumption. I try to avoid the use of aluminum to the most maximum possible extent. But if a client comes and asks you, I'm running a practice, I live by my practice. The client comes and says, I want to use an aluminium railing. I mean, you have no choice. If you say don't know, you will not be able to practice. I'm not a Puritan to that extent. But I try to convince them. And I think I've been quite successful in convincing many of my clients about the kind of materials which are being used. But I believe that client is the king or customer is the king. And I mean, it's always compromises that you make. So I will not claim that any of my buildings are 100% sustainable. It's a compromise which you make between the client's requirements and client's fantasies and dreams and about your vision about the environment and the future. Okay.
Thank you. So that was really insightful. We'll move on to the next question. Cost effectiveness and sustainability tend to contradict each other. How do you deal with this in your project?
See, my first job was with Laurie Baker. And Laurie Baker is considered to be an expert in low-cost construction. I never use the word low-cost construction. We always used to say cost-effective construction. Because the people have a feeling that anything low-cost is low quality, which he always questioned. It's a relative term. I mean, low cost means compared with what? So that was his concept about this thing, which I think is very correct. And one of the greatest values or things which I found in Laurie Baker is that he reduced the cost without compromising on the performance of the building. See, if there are 10 doors in a house, you use only 8 doors. The cost is reduced naturally. That is cost reduction by elimination. You don't use something, the cost will come down. There is nothing great about it. You have to get the same performance, and that is what he tried to do. You should not be using low quality materials. That is not what he tried to do. It should be linked with cost effectiveness, should be linked with the performance of the building. I mean, performance means durability, less maintenance cost, better thermal comfort. All these things are to do with performances. I'll repeat it once again: better thermal comfort, durability of the building, less maintenance. You can reduce the cost, but if it starts causing maintenance issues from the first year, it is not cost reduction. Because eventually you spend more money. You can reduce cost, but you find that you put a GI sheet roof and you find that it's unbearable at 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock in the afternoon to be inside the room, then it's not cost reduction. Of course, using GI sheet, the cost will come down compared with a concrete roof. But that's not cost reduction according to Laurie Baker. So what he tried to do was to get the performance and with the thermal comfort, with the durability, with less maintenance. And when you see Laurie Baker's objective, he was a man ahead of his times. At that time, there was nobody used the word sustainable development or sustainable architecture or green architecture. But what he practiced was entirely that. So if you have cost effectiveness, is nothing economic sustainability. At the same time, you have a better performing building, that is green architecture or sustainable architecture. Because he is looking at durability, he is looking at less maintenance, he is looking at a better performance of the building. And it is not just using a particular type of glass or a particular type of carpet inside the houses or using some features is not. I would like to see the definition of cost effectiveness and sustainability and green buildings in a much broader way, the way Laurie Baker taught me. I hope you are able to understand what I'm trying to tell. there are any questions, I'm able to answer.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. We were able to understand it. So next question is, like, how can we use materials of vernacular architecture in tall buildings?
See, the tallest timber building in the world is 26 stories or 24 stories. It is called Ho Tower. It's in Vienna city. HO Tower, that's the name. And it uses 80% timber. I'm telling from my memory. It might be 75% or even 85%, but 80% of the building material used, except for the glass and some sanitary fixtures and everything. The walls are timber, the floor is timber, everything is timber. And the frame is timber, minimizing the use of the concrete. So the materials of vernacular architecture, if we use properly, can be used to build multi-storied buildings. I have seen timber buildings which are designed by architects. I was there in London Design Festival 2015 or 16. And what happens during London Design Festival, 2 days of the 1 week, all the design shops, fairs, exhibitions are there. And 2 days, all the buildings are open. Many of the buildings are open to the public, and this is well announced. And you can go and visit private residences, offices, complexes which are open by the public. And the architect will be there in those buildings. Or somebody from the architect's office will be there to explain. And I've seen one of the things which I tried to use was to see the timber frame buildings, multi-storied buildings, beyond this 15 meters high. I was able to see many buildings which are new buildings constructed with timber as the predominantly as the, of course, it is called CLT buildings, cross-laminated timber. So there is a technology which has come where the cross-laminated timber is used in buildings. Do you know the oldest apartment building in New York, which was built in 1885, is 15 stories high? It is called Osborne Apartments. Still standing. 1885, 15 stories high, New York City. It's still there. I've been to New York. Thousands of buildings which are built in the 19th century or early 20th century, which uses concrete to the minimum. Multi-story buildings. Of course, New York City had the World Trade Center and of course the Empire State Building is in Chicago, but New York City has so many other taller buildings, including the UN headquarters building, which is also quite tall. So there are these things. There was a structural engineering know-how in 1885 when the Osborne Apartments were built in New York, 15 stories high. Since 1885, 140 years have passed, or 135 years, our structural engineering know-how has increased multiple times with the knowledge of computers and with the use of computers. We are not using the 21st century know-how in designing our buildings. We still try to think that, it's a wrong thing. The architects and engineers have been taught about steel and concrete, and they just try to go with those buildings, those building materials. In 1960s, late 1960s and early 1970s, there was a movement by a group of structural engineers under the leadership of WG13 or WJ13, I don't remember, you can just Google, who said brick is beautiful. They said all these Victorian buildings which were built many stories high without any structural engineering know-how. Now we know how to design a masonry building. There are so many techniques by which we can do. I've seen 5-storied school building built with 4.5-inch brickwork in Wales, in England. Modern building. Baker has designed a hostel building in 4.5-inch brickwork, 3 stories. I've designed 4-story building with 9-inch brickwork. I've done. You use the modern know-how of this, and even there are multi-span timber roof buildings using the cross-laminated timber. See, unfortunately, we have a habit of going by the conventional route. There is so much to be looked into. So many changes are happening across the world, and we don't look into it. So, I mean, as students, all of you should be exposed to many of these things, is what is required. And now, I mean, I heard that in Finland, a new city is coming up, a satellite city is coming up with timber buildings. You don't see, if you go into UK or anything, you don't see many new buildings coming up in concrete. All these residences of 2 stories and 3 stories come with timber as the frame. So this is the way it comes. So you have to look at things which are, let us not commit the mistakes which have been committed by the Western world in the 50s and 60s and 70s. Let us look at these things in a new light. Okay.
Thank you for sharing these interesting facts, sir. We also have a few questions from the students. I think they'll ask directly.
Yeah.
So my question is, as you said, design is very client specific. Laurie Baker, sir, to believe that every house is unique and should be customized according to user. So with that said, what do you think about the mass-produced prefabricated housing solutions for meeting with increasing demands?
See, I think they're very inhuman. We have to look at a human side of architecture. You as younger generation should look into it more. And when I had to do a fisherman village in Tarangambadi or Trangobar, where we did more than 1,000 buildings, 2 places, we customized each house. We tried to customize, at least what I can. None of the houses looks the same. And it's the mass production of housing, mass housing. Every fisherman, every tribal person, every agriculture worker, they also deserve the services of an architect. It's very, very important that they also learn about some of these things. And so prefabricated housing, unfortunately, will not come very cheap. What we don't do in India is we don't spend much time on planning. See, if a residence is going to be built in, say, UK, a customized house, they will spend 2 years on planning and 1 year on, or 8 months on the construction. Here, we'll spend 3 months on the planning and 2.5 years on the construction. So that is what is happening. Personally, I'm not a prefabricated person. And I think it's never going to solve the housing problem in India. It's the 55 million or 60 million families in India, it has been growing every year. It's never going to get a house with prefabricated housing. Although the slum clearance board is in Chennai, etc. Today I was just going to one of my sites and I could see concrete prefab. You can't even drive a nail or you can't introduce this thing happening. Buildings built in the 1980s were demolished and these are the kind of buildings coming up. Baker believed that earth is going to be the future building material. And he thinks that if the housing problem in India is going to be solved, it will be earth houses or the mud houses. I believe that it will be, if timber will be the future building material, because it is the only thing which can be renewed, which can be reused, and timber is the only thing which can reverse the climate change or the global warming, or timber is the only thing, trees are the only things which can reverse the climate change. If we use more and more trees in buildings, the carbon gets locked in the timber. Carbon doesn't get atmosphere. So if you use more and more timber in buildings, then we'll be working towards reversing the climate change. And customization is important. All these factory produced ones is fine. I think house is a home. I mean, don't use the word home. Is a highly customized product. Corbusier said that house is a machine to live in. Fan is a machine. Ceiling fan is a machine. If it goes wrong, you can throw away the fan and buy a new fan. But you cannot throw away the house like that. It involves so many resources. And in this era of global warming and climate change and sustainability, this is very, very important that we look at the resources. I've been seeing this. Of course, when asbestos came in the 1940s, it was described as a wonderful building material solving the roofing problems. I mean, it's a great solution for the roofing problem. Now we can have houses. When it was used extensively, not only in India, in all the developed countries, building schools after the Second World War came in with asbestos roof. But what happened? Later on, we found that it is causing cancer. So we have to look into all these things. I've seen, yesterday one of the clients asked me, shall we go with UPVC windows, which is what all these apartment people are doing. And he is to ask me, do you want to go, what is your opinion about timber? I said, during my last 35 years, I saw iron windows in the 80s. I saw aluminum windows in the 90s, and then both were replaced by, then PVC doors came. Nobody used it. But now UPVC doors and some other material. None of these materials replace timber, which is a traditional building material. These are time tested. You have to look at some of the prefabricated solutions, buildings which were constructed in Europe, and they were destroyed by putting this controlled bombing. The way these buildings were demolished. And in US, they call it Hope 4 or Hope 5 program during the Reagan administration. Late 90s, they demolished many of the so-called council flats, they call it. De-densified those areas. So all these problems we have to look at. It's not the interest of a company or a manufacturer of a particular material that architects and building professionals should be looking to protect. We should look at all these issues. I'm not a prefabricated person, and I think it is never going to solve the housing problem. That's my take on it.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for throwing some light on the scenario in India about sharing about various materials. My next question is, how do you consciously try to preserve the cultural identity of any place in your projects?
See, I said earlier that architecture is involved, is very multidimensional. There are so many factors or indicators connected with it. I try to give importance to something, then another things. There is a trade-off which happens. One of my client believes I design a nice building, and my client comes and say, you cannot have a door in this position. As per Vastu, it has to be in this particular position. there you do a trade-off. You can't, if you are practicing, people might say that you are compromising, but I would like to call it a trade-off, which happens in every design process. Culture is very deep. You have to respect the clients and their beliefs. Something you might find them to be very ridiculous. And you might, it's completely against your beliefs, but you try to do it. I don't go to church. I'm not a practicing Christian. But I've gone to church when my grandparents requested me. My father never requested me to go to church. But when my grandparents, when they were alive, when they requested me to go to church, I used to do. Because you respect your grandparents. I don't see it as a compromise which I made, because I think it is my duty to respect my grandparents. This is one of the value systems which I've been told. Treat the clients as individuals. Society is changing, culture is changing, design is also changing. You should design buildings which can get adapted to these changes in the future. It is not easy to change the buildings. As I said earlier, if we find a fan, not finding useful, you can throw it out. It's a mission, it's a part. You can throw a mission, but you cannot throw a house. You have to live with it. Once you design and build a house, unless you are that kind of filthy rich, you will not be able to say that, no, this is what has happened. I will not live in this house. I want to demolish everything. It's there. It adjustments. When you move into an apartment, you're making an adjustment. You buy a Innova car for Krista Innova car for 18 lakhs rupees, which they say that it will seat 7 people. But for the 6th person to sit, somebody has to get out. In Europe or in Japan, where the car would have originated, the 6th and 7th is the place for keeping vegetables and luggage. And in India, when they marketed it, they said 7-seater Krista car. And this is what happens everywhere. So you make adjustments, you just try to do. But respect everything. Respect the clients. Respect their beliefs. Even if it is wrong, don't say it is wrong. You don't say it, you don't accept it, but the next day, after 1 week, there are so many clients which comes and I tell them that I try to do according to your requirements, but I think it won't look nice. I'm telling from my experience, most of the clients will oblige with you. They will believe in you. You have to develop a trust between you and your client. Trusting each other is important for the easy design process. Design doesn't end with drawing the plan sections and elevations. Design will end only when the house is occupied by the house owner or the client. So try to see it in a different way. It will never end. Nothing is to be preserved forever. Culture will change. Society will change. Everything will change. The only thing which will not change is my statement that everything is changing. Okay.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for answering that with beautiful analogies. Thank you.
Good evening, sir. I was interested in learning your views on how does vernacular architecture blend in contemporary surroundings?
You see, how many building materials have come into use, wide use, in the last 100 years? There are very few. We still use bricks. Instead of lime, we use cement. That is a slight replacement which has happened during the last 100 years or become popular in the last 50, 60 years. Vernacular architecture uses local materials. One advantage of the local materials or the vernacular architecture is that it is built according to the climate. If you follow the principles of the vernacular architecture, you will find that it respects the local climate. And with the development of the science and technology, which has happened, tremendous change. The way the science and technology is developing is so fast, and it's very difficult to keep pace with it. Concrete as glass has become a fashion in many other places, including India. You go through the IT corridor of Chennai city, that OMR, Old Mahabalipuram Road, you will find there are hundreds of buildings built with concrete and glass. But in the 1920s, the Corbusier's writing, if you read Corbusier said in his book called The City of Tomorrow, which was published in 1929. The City of Tomorrow is the title. He said that our cities are not meant for horses. We need to take automobile cars into our cities, so the streets have to be widened. And he said the technology has changed. We know how to do multi-story buildings or tall buildings. And we don't have to build according to the climate, because we know how to create an artificial environment inside the building by either doing heating or by air conditioning it. And he also said that if you read the book 1929, it's still available in Amazon. Please buy and read it. Every architecture student should read that book. He said that we should build tall buildings or multi-story buildings in forests. 15% of the area should be built up. 85% should be kept as green areas or forests. What has happened since Corbusier's time? 85% was built up and 15% was left as open spaces. Why did it happen? It was the profit motive of the few people. Architects became tools or puppets in the hands of the developers. And this is what has happened. This is why our built environment has degenerated over the years. I'm nothing against, I also do developers projects. I'm not saying, I do it in my way. And that is what my way is there. But this is what also Corbusier said, none of the apartments should be more than 15 floors height. He said offices can be 50 floors height, 50, where the apartment should be 15 floors height. If you look at the architects of Europe, and if you look at the readings and many of those things, you will find that they are very prone or very involved with the social issues. But unfortunately, architects, I said architects and conservation are considered to be of an elite kind of profession in India. Unfortunately, this is what is happening in India. Now, coming back to the situation, Corbusier's argument was correct in his times, but we saw the huge energy shortage or energy crisis in the 1970s. Oil prices went up sharply. Now we know there is a huge energy crisis. Now the diesel prices have shot beyond 100 rupees, or the petrol prices is becoming 110 rupees, and it's going to shot up again and again. So so energy is becoming expensive. Air conditioning is becoming expensive. And we have got rid of an architecture where the passive methods of cooling and heating gave way to artificial methods of heating and cooling. But now we know that is no longer possible. So the old thought process is coming back again and again, which means nowadays we are looking at vernacular buildings. And this mistakes which has happened in Europe and all of those things, which has happened in the 60s and 70s, we are making the same kind of mistakes now by not following out. Even in the era of climate change and global warming and the energy shortage, we still are not looking at a building which will use minimum amount of energy, makes least impact on the environment. We are looking at getting platinum rated certification and gold rated certification. Are we doing it from our heart, or are we doing it as a marketing gimmick? This is my question. I always, in our office, we try to design buildings. Whatever the projects we do, we try to do it with certain ethics, which is built into our system or our system of designing, which I think is very, very important. And in our designing, vernacular architecture plays a major role in the kind of buildings that we do. We are not using vernacular architecture as a style. You go to a Chinese restaurant and a 5-star hotel, you will find some Chinese emblems and colors and some statues and all those things. You go to a Chettinad restaurant, they put 2 Chettinad columns in the middle and put a little bit slope roof and call it a Chettinad restaurant. I'm not trying to talk about in style. I'm trying to learn from the basic principles of vernacular architecture or traditional architecture or whatever you want to call it, our own history. Go to our roots and then design. Then you will be able to design some of the best buildings which will stand the test of time. And that is what is more important than what you have to do.
Thank you, sir. That was very insightful. But I also wanted to know, what is your take on the government's smart cities mission?
See, I'm not very much aware of the smart cities. I know it is happening. I've been into some meetings or some committees. Let it happen. I mean, we have various schemes. The same medicine comes in different bottles. It will be, at one time, it will be Indira Gandhi Awas Yojana, which will get changed to Prime Minister's Awas Yojana. I mean, all these things we have been seeing, and which we are, as you said, same medicine in new bottles, new labels. But when 50% of India's population doesn't have access to safe drinking water, when 1/3 of the population of India do not have toilet facilities, what should be the strategy that we should be adopting? One thing is very clear. We have to respect the historic core or the heritage part of our cities. It is not. Unfortunately, we have been equating these big tower-like multi-storied concrete structures as symbols of development. I don't believe in that. We have to understand it is not just the monuments which has to be protected. Let us conserve our inner cities or the historic cities. And this is the mistake which was made by all the Western countries by developing freeways and motorways and expressways. What they did in the US is suburbanization or suburbanism, it is called. They neglected the historic cities completely. They realized their mistakes. And 80s and 90s, all these big cities, very modern cities, have tried to go and look into their inner cities, where the poor, old people, unemployed lived. The rich people lived in the suburbs because they had access to the motorways. I am of the opinion that deurbanization is the solution to many of our problems, although 99.99% of the professionals will not agree to it. We have been hearing all these statistics. 60% of the people will live in cities by 2030, 70% will live in cities by 2050. I think that will be disastrous. I think it's time that we look at smaller towns and villages and give importance. And this is same what Mahatma Gandhi, our father of the nation, has said in 1909 in his book called Hind Swaraj. He said that India lives in its villages. India is not living in its cities. People migrate to Bombay or Chennai or to Delhi or to Calcutta. They are not going there to live in apartments. They are going in search of their livelihood. They are going in search of their jobs. If we can give these kind of things in our small towns and villages, then India will develop in a different way. We have neglected the villages. We have not listened to our father of the nation. This is the same thing in another way. Schumacher has said, small is beautiful. I'm not a great fan of small is beautiful, but I think there are certain arguments which he has made, Schumacher has made in his book is there. I'm not taking a romantic view of the villages. Our cities we will not be able to live in cities. People in Delhi, even before the pandemic came, the children were going with masks because Delhi was so polluted. Supreme Court ruled that on Monday, even number of cars can get into the streets. Tuesday, odd number of cars, odd number plates can get in. And this is what Supreme Court ruled. Why? Cities are so polluted. Delhi, which is the capital city, which had no shortage of money, any amount of money, this kind of developments people have spent money in our capital city is so huge. Flyovers and underpasses and all these things which has happened, widening of the roads, destruction of the forest and natural, it has happened in that. What people need is pure air and pure water. They need to breathe fresh air and they will live longer. The number of people, who have died out of you can just Google and find out. Air pollution, people breathing foul air. Per year, I've looked into various studies. There are certain studies which say 3.4 million deaths per annum. There are some which says 4.2, some which says 5.7. But whatever those numbers, 3.4 was the minimum number I could find. It's almost equivalent to the number of deaths caused in the last 1 year due to Corona. And we could see, how our cities were cleaner during lockdown. How people could see from Patiala or not Jalandhar. I think Jalandhar, they could see Himalayas, which they could never see because the vehicles were under lockdown. The air became pure. Do you want to destroy the life of the future generations? And we have to think about these things. And these are the things which should be considered when we plan smart cities. I think we should, when you have smart cities, we should be looking at smart towns and smart villages as well. Much more growth. And if we don't look at it, we will get it the nature, that's exactly what we happened in all these years by nature giving back to us. Things are not going to be very easy for the future. The problem, the nature is giving back much faster. Maybe because of the digital technology. Earlier it used to give back much later. Now it gives back in 2 years. Anything. This is the way it is happening now. And I think the future generation has to be very strongly, you have to demand very strongly that certain things have to be looked at in a particular way. Okay. Any more questions? Or?
Yes, sir. Good evening, sir. So we had a few rapid fire questions that we would like to ask you. One is, can you name two materials, one modern and one vernacular, that you prefer working with or is fascinated by?
Say, I am always interested in timber. Timber is my favorite building material. And it's the only thing, as I said earlier, which can reverse the climate change. If you ask me to tell the modern material, I would like to use concrete in a nice manner. But the way concrete is being used is not making the full use of the material, the way it is being used. I mean, I'm not against any of the building materials as such. I like all the building materials. But when you try to look at the wider things, you try to choose the particular building material as well. I'm now trying to, I would like to use concrete as a very expressive element in the next 10 years if possible. But clients come with certain fixed ideas. I'm forced to do the typical, they come to me with a different idea. Perhaps I will get a client who wants to use concrete in a completely different way, and I would love to do it as well. Yeah. I've kept the answer short because you said rapid fire questions.
Yes, sir. So next would be, can you name one of your favorite projects that you have worked on?
See, all projects are my favorites. Because you get involved in every project. I design an Institute of Palliative Medicine in Calicut. And it's a 50,000 square feet campus or 60,000 square feet campus. And while the building construction was going on, the hospital part, Institute of Palliative Hospital part was already done. So I went for one of my site visits, and I visited, the hospital part of it where patients are being admitted. So I went and asked one of the patients, how do you feel after coming to this palliative hospital? And he said, half my illness is gone after I came here. And that is the best compliment an architect or designer can get from from a client, from a user. He's not the client, he's a patient, he's a user. And that is very important. So every design should give back to you something. When you hear from somebody that, oh, we love that project, we enjoyed being there, or we like that part you design. It always gives a level of satisfaction to you. It's very, 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 very fulfilling, and that is what drives you into doing the next project.
Yes, sir. Sir, so thinking back to your architecture school, architecture days, when you were learning it, what would you say your favorite subject was back then?
I already told that I did not do architecture degree.
Yes,
and
sir.
I'll answer. I always believe that if I'd taken an architecture degree, I would not have become like this. That also sometimes I think. I think some of the students are being fed certain wrong ideas by the architecture schools, so wrong impressions which is there, could be there. But if one of the subjects which I would love to teach is history of architecture. If you study history, not the way you study what is the diameter of the Pantheon dome, doesn't make any sense. When you have a Google at your thing, what is the point in trying to, your exam questions being asked, or what did this thing? And the way the history of architecture is taught taught nowadays is completely wrong. And I had an architecture professor who taught me during my master's in UK, Derek Lindstrom. He was an architectural historian. I was one of his favorite students, and I learned quite a bit about the history. I mean, the way I try to look at many of the things now is I had so many masters or so many mentors, starting with Laurie Baker. So Derek Lindstrom was one of the person who taught me how to look at architecture history. And I think it's very, very important to understand the history of architecture and the way various things, and even in the way in many of the answering many of the questions, I told many of the things which you will never learn in your architecture school, but which is linked with the history of architecture or what happened 50 years ago or 75 years ago. So I try to see how the movement has changed, how the changes are happening. I try to study it, I read it. I read the criticisms of those things. So when you say the tall buildings, I look at how many people have criticized tall buildings. What are their objections? What are their criticisms? And I try to learn from it. And that helps in me trying to do designing of new buildings now. Okay. So history of architecture.
That is good to know, sir. So one last question in the rapid fire session. So can you name any one building or design that moved you or inspired you in any way or any method or at any time, sir?
You want a modern building or a traditional building? Which one?
Any building, sir. Like it could even be one not even famous building. It could be any building, sir. Like one that you saw somewhere off the street.
Okay. The building I've seen most, I don't know how many times I would have visited that building. At least 300, 500. I used to have a railway season ticket to see this building, Padmanabhapuram Palace. I used to live in Trivandrum city, and I used to go and see this palace having a railway season ticket. Whenever I used to get time, I used to go and see the building. I think this is the building which every architecture student should see it, learn from it. And one of the greatest things of any important building is even 100 times, 200 times, 500 times, 1,000 times, still you will enjoy it. And one of such building is Padmanabhapuram Palace. The buildings I like, which is what I have designed, is Dakshina Chitra. I still see it once in a month. I still do designing there. I can see that building 200 times, 500 times, or any number of times. I don't know how many times I've been to that campus, at least 5. I've been working on that campus and designing of various buildings for 26 years. 95, I took over the designing of the campus, and I've been doing buildings there again and again. And if it's none of this thing, Eiffel Tower and Pompidou Center. If you want a very modern thing, I think Pompidou Center will be one of the 10 buildings I will select, whether built 1,000 years ago, 100 years ago, or any of those things. And Eiffel Tower is, again, every time I go to Paris, I go to both these buildings without any hesitation. You have to understand, Eiffel Tower was once hated by some people. But I think it's a great symbol of Paris now. The city, it's not the building which matters, it's the setting around it. Pompidou Center, I like the square in front, and I like the museum, and I like the various things connected with that. So that's it.
Thank you, sir. We'll definitely at least try to visit Padmanabhapuram Palace, sir.
Yeah. Anything else, or?